That girl was cruelly punished for an innocent mistake and left alone in the rain. On the other side of the glass, the stepmother watched the suffering as if it were a show. But that night, the father returned earlier than expected, and what he saw made everything hidden begin to crumble. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The crystal glass shattered against the marble floor of the Greenwich mansion, its fragments scattering like frozen tears across the pristine white surface. 7-year-old Emma stood frozen, her small hands trembling as she stared at the broken pieces of what had been her stepmother's most prized possession, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of the Ashford family. Victoria Ashford stood in the doorway of the grand dining room, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles turned white. The air in the room grew heavy with tension as the stepmother's green eyes narrowed, studying the blonde child who had dared to touch something so precious without permission. Emma had only wanted to help clear the table after dinner, to show that she could be useful, that she could be good enough to earn a smile or perhaps even a kind word. The storm outside had been building all evening, dark clouds rolling in from Long Island Sound, bringing with them the promise of a harsh November night. Inside the mansion, however, a different kind of storm was brewing, one far more dangerous and unpredictable than anything nature could conjure. Victoria's voice, when it finally came, was cold and measured, each word carefully chosen to cut as deeply as possible. The punishment she devised was swift and cruel. Emma would spend the next hour in the garden, she announced, to think about respect and responsibility. The little girl's pale blue eyes widened in disbelief as she looked down at her thin cotton dress, the delicate fabric offering no protection against the elements that raged beyond the tall windows. The rain had started as a gentle drizzle when Emma first stepped outside, her bare feet touching the cold, wet grass. Within minutes, however, the sky opened up completely, unleashing a torrent that soaked through her dress and plastered her blonde hair against her small face. She found a spot beneath the old oak tree near the rose garden, curling into herself, knees pulled tight against her chest, trying desperately to preserve what little warmth remained in her shivering body. From the illuminated window of the sitting room, Victoria watched with crossed arms and an expression that betrayed no remorse. To her, this was necessary, a lesson in discipline that the child's biological mother had failed to instill. Sarah Bennett had been too soft, too loving, too permissive. Victoria saw it as her duty to reshape this child, to mold her into something more acceptable, more befitting of the Ashford name and fortune. Emma's teeth chattered uncontrollably as the rain pounded down on her. She could see the warm glow of the mansion's interior, could imagine the fireplace crackling in the den where she had spent so many happy evenings before her father married Victoria. Those memories felt like they belonged to a different lifetime, to a different girl who had known what it felt like to be safe and loved. The headlights cut through the darkness like beacons of hope, sweeping across the long driveway as Richard Ashford's black Mercedes pulled up to the entrance. He had not been expected home for another 3 days. His business in Singapore meant to keep him away through the following week. Something had nagged at him, though, an inexplicable feeling that had grown stronger with each passing hour, until he had finally booked an earlier flight home. As he stepped out of the car, adjusting his suit jacket against the rain, his eyes swept across the grounds out of habit. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, beneath the oak tree, barely visible in the darkness, was a small figure huddled against the elements. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. Emma, his daughter, his precious little girl left outside in a storm that had already flooded parts of the driveway. Richard ran, his expensive Italian shoes splashing through puddles as he raced toward his daughter. He shrugged off his coat mid-stride, reaching Emma in seconds that felt like hours. The moment he wrapped the warm fabric around her tiny, shaking frame, she looked up at him with eyes that held both relief and something that broke his heart even more, a desperate fear that he might send her back out into the cold. Emma collapsed against her father's chest, her sobs mixing with the rain as he lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the house. His jaw was set, anger and guilt warring within him as he processed what he had just discovered. How long had she been out here? How had this happened? And most importantly, where was Victoria? The warmth of the mansion enveloped them as Richard carried Emma through the back entrance, water dripping from both of them onto the polished hardwood floors that Victoria insisted be kept spotless at all times. He took the stairs 2 at a time, heading directly to Emma's bedroom where he wrapped her in the thick comforter from her bed, then rushed to the bathroom to start a warm bath. Victoria appeared in the doorway of Emma's room, her composure carefully arranged, a practiced expression of concern on her face. She had changed into a different outfit, Richard noticed, her earlier clothes nowhere to be seen. She began to speak, her voice smooth and reasonable, explaining that Emma had been careless, had broken a priceless family heirloom, and needed to learn about consequences. She painted herself as the responsible parent, making difficult but necessary choices for the child's character development. Richard listened in silence as he dried Emma's hair with a towel, his daughter now dressed in warm pajamas and wrapped in blankets on her bed. When Victoria finished her carefully crafted explanation, he simply looked at her, his blue eyes cold in a way she had never seen before. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The disappointment and anger in his gaze spoke volumes. That night marked a shift in the household, though not the resolution Emma desperately needed. Richard stayed home from work the following week, something unprecedented in his career. He observed. He watched the interactions between his wife and daughter with new eyes, noticing things he had previously dismissed or simply not seen. The way Victoria's compliments to Emma always contained a barb. The way she compared the child constantly to her biological mother, always unfavorably. During a dinner party 2 weeks later, Richard witnessed Victoria's subtle cruelty in full display. Important business associates and their families filled the formal dining room, and Emma had been allowed to join for the first course, dressed in a blue velvet dress that had belonged to Sarah. Victoria smiled warmly at their guests as she introduced Emma, then added with a light laugh that the child was difficult, but that she was trying her best to improve her, that Sarah had been too emotional and had passed that trait on to her daughter. Emma's small hands tightened around her fork as color rose to her cheeks. She stared down at her plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Richard saw his daughter shrinking into herself, saw the way she seemed to be trying to disappear right there at the table. After the guests left, he tried to talk to Emma about what had happened, but she had already learned the cost of speaking up. She simply shook her head and said everything was fine. Victoria's next move was calculated and strategic. She approached Richard in his study one evening with documents and a proposal. She wanted to formally adopt Emma, she explained. It would give the child stability, make her feel like a true part of the Ashford family, eliminate any legal complications should anything unexpected happen. She spoke of love and commitment, of wanting to be a real mother to Emma, not just a stepmother. Richard felt torn. Part of him wanted to believe that Victoria's intentions were genuine, that perhaps the incident with the storm had been an isolated lapse in judgment. He signed preliminary papers, agreeing to begin the process, though something in his gut told him to proceed slowly. What he did not know was that Victoria had already set additional plans in motion, plans that went far beyond simple adoption papers. Emma discovered the truth by accident. She had been looking for her father in his study when she noticed a folder left open on his desk. Inside were documents with her name, papers that seemed to be changing things, erasing things. She saw her mother's name crossed out, replaced with Victoria's. She did not understand all the legal language, but she understood enough to feel panic rising in her chest. When Emma tried to tell her father what she had found, Victoria had already prepared the ground. She had mentioned to Richard over breakfast that Emma had been acting strangely, that she seemed to be having trouble distinguishing reality from imagination, that perhaps the influence of Sarah's mother, Margaret, was causing confusion. The seed was planted, and when Emma came to him with her concerns, Richard hesitated, wondering if his daughter was indeed mixing up documents she did not fully comprehend. Margaret Bennet had been trying to reach her granddaughter for months. Phone calls went unanswered, letters were returned unopened, and the few times she managed to leave small gifts at the mansion's gate, they seemed to disappear without ever reaching Emma. The elderly woman lived just 40 minutes away in Stamford, close enough to visit, but kept at a distance by invisible walls that Victoria had carefully constructed. Sarah's mother represented everything Victoria wanted to erase. Margaret carried memories of Emma's early years, stories of Sarah's gentleness and warmth, proof that the child had once been surrounded by unconditional love. These memories were dangerous to Victoria's reconstruction project. She needed Emma to doubt those happy times, to question whether they had ever truly existed. Victoria presented her case to Richard with perfect timing, catching him during a particularly stressful work week when a major deal was falling apart. She expressed concern about Margaret's persistent attempts at contact, suggesting that the older woman was unable to let go of the past. She painted a picture of Margaret as someone clinging desperately to Sarah through Emma, preventing the child from moving forward and accepting her new family structure. Richard, exhausted and overwhelmed, made a decision he would later deeply regret. He agreed to limit Margaret's access to Emma. No more phone calls during school nights. No more unannounced visits. Any contact would need to be scheduled in advance and supervised. He told himself he was protecting his daughter from confusion and emotional turmoil, but in reality, he was isolating her from the last person who truly understood her pain. The effects on Emma were immediate and devastating. The little girl who had once been bright and talkative became quiet and withdrawn. At the private school she attended, teachers noticed the change. Emma, who had always participated enthusiastically in class, now sat silently at her desk, rarely raising her hand even when she knew the answers. During recess, she would find a corner of the playground and sit alone, watching the other children play. Victoria's comments became a daily occurrence, each one carefully crafted to chip away at Emma's sense of self. She would compare Emma's table manners unfavorably to those of other children. She would sigh dramatically when Emma struggled with her homework, suggesting that Sarah had spoiled her rather than properly educating her. She would remind Emma constantly that she needed to be strong, not weak like her mother had been. The psychological warfare was subtle enough that Richard, when he was home, often missed it entirely. Victoria was a master of timing, saving her most cutting remarks for moments when they were alone, or disguising them as concern in front of others. At formal dinners and charity events, she would introduce Emma with statements that sounded loving, but carried hidden messages that the child understood all too well. Emma began to have nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night, calling out for her mother, only to find Victoria standing in her doorway instead, looking at her with an expression that mixed annoyance with something that looked almost like satisfaction. The child started to doubt her own memories. Had her mother really read her stories every night? Had there really been picnics in the park, an afternoon spent baking cookies together? Or had she imagined it all, created a fantasy version of the past to escape her current reality? Anxiety took root in Emma's small chest, growing like a thorny vine that wrapped around her heart and lungs, making it hard to breathe sometimes. She developed a habit of checking and rechecking everything, terrified of making mistakes that would give Victoria more ammunition. She would lay her school clothes out the night before, then wake up early to make sure she had chosen correctly. She practiced her handwriting over and over, knowing Victoria would criticize any letter that looked imperfect. At school events, Emma became invisible. When parents gathered to watch their children perform in plays or concerts, Emma would search the audience for her father's face, hoping he had made it this time. More often than not, she would find Victoria sitting alone, her expression broadcasting a mixture of duty and martyrdom that made Emma feel like a burden. The other children began to notice that something was different about Emma Ashford, that the blonde girl with the sad eyes never seemed quite present, even when she was standing right there among them. The cracks in Victoria's carefully maintained facade began to show during the spring of Emma's third year living under her stepmother's control. A concerned teacher named Mrs. Patricia Wilson had been documenting Emma's behavioral changes, noting the child's increasing isolation and the way she flinched at unexpected sounds or movements. Mrs. Wilson had taught for over 20 years and had seen enough troubled children to recognize the signs of emotional distress. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Richard was in a meeting. Mrs. Wilson reached out to the mansion, asking to speak with either parent about Emma's well-being. Victoria took the call, her voice dripping with practiced concern as she listened to the teacher's observations. She responded with carefully chosen words about Emma's difficulty adjusting to her mother's absence, about the child's tendency toward dramatics, about Victoria's own tireless efforts to help the girl overcome her emotional fragility. But Mrs. Wilson was not easily swayed. She had seen Emma's artwork, dark scribbles that covered bright colors, houses with all the windows blacked out, figures standing alone in empty spaces. She had read Emma's creative writing assignments, stories filled with characters trapped in towers or lost in endless forests. These were not the expressions of a child who was simply adjusting to change. They were cries for help. When Richard finally received Mrs. Wilson's written report, forwarded to him by the school principal, he could no longer avoid the truth staring him in the face. He sat in his study, reading and rereading the observations, the specific incidents, the teacher's professional concerns. A particularly damning paragraph described how Emma had burst into tears during a class discussion about families, unable to explain what was wrong but clearly in distress. That evening, Richard made a decision. He would work from home for the foreseeable future. He would be present, truly present in a way he had failed to be since marrying Victoria. He would observe, and he would protect his daughter from whatever was causing her such obvious pain, even if that threat came from within his own household. Victoria sensed the shift immediately. She adapted her strategy, becoming warmer and more affectionate toward Emma when Richard was present, while simultaneously ramping up her psychological manipulation when they were alone. She began leaving notes in Emma's room, messages that appeared supportive on the surface, but contained subtle implications that Emma was inherently flawed, that she needed Victoria's guidance to become acceptable. One afternoon, Richard came home early from a business lunch and heard voices in the garden. He approached quietly, not intending to eavesdrop but finding himself unable to walk away from what he was hearing. Victoria was speaking to Emma in a tone he had never heard her use before, cold and cutting, telling the child that her mother had been weak, and that weakness was why Sarah was no longer with them, that if Emma did not learn to be stronger, she would end up just as helpless. Emma's small voice responded, barely audible, asking why Victoria hated her so much. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood frozen behind a hedge, waiting for Victoria's answer, praying she would deny it, would explain it away as a misunderstanding. Instead, she laughed, a sound devoid of warmth, and told Emma not to be dramatic, that she did not hate her, she simply expected better. That night, after Emma was asleep, Richard confronted Victoria. Not with anger, but with a quiet firmness that brooked no argument. He told her what he had overheard. He presented her with Mrs. Wilson's report. He showed her a letter he had found hidden under Emma's pillow, written in the child's careful handwriting, addressed to Sarah, begging her mother to come back and take away the fear that had become Emma's constant companion. Victoria attempted to defend herself, to explain her methods as tough love, as necessary discipline. But Richard had finally, painfully, opened his eyes to the reality of what his daughter had been enduring. He saw now how Victoria had systematically isolated Emma, eroded her confidence, and attempted to erase the memory of Sarah. The adoption papers, he realized with horror, were not about giving Emma stability, but about giving Victoria complete control. The argument that followed was the first real confrontation between them, years of unspoken tensions finally erupting. Victoria accused Richard of being too soft, of being unable to see what Emma really needed. Richard, for his first time since marrying her, stood his ground completely. The following morning brought an unexpected ally to Emma's corner. Richard contacted Margaret Bennet directly, apologizing for the distance he had allowed to grow between grandmother and granddaughter. The reunion took place on a sunny Saturday afternoon in the mansion's garden, the same place where Emma had once spent that terrible night in the storm. Margaret's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw Emma. The child had grown taller, but she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of unhappiness she carried. Emma ran to her grandmother's arms, and for the first time in years she felt truly safe. Margaret held her granddaughter close, whispering words of love and reassurance, telling Emma stories about Sarah that Victoria had tried so hard to erase. Victoria watched from the upstairs window, her expression unreadable. She knew she was losing her grip on the situation, but she was not ready to surrender yet. That evening she made a calculated move. She presented Richard with evidence she had been gathering, emails and messages allegedly from Margaret that painted the older woman as unstable and vengeful, determined to turn Emma against her stepmother. But Richard had learned to question Victoria's narratives. He examined the emails closely, and noticed discrepancies, details that did not quite add up. The writing style did not match other correspondence he had received from Margaret. The email addresses were slightly off, similar but not identical to Margaret's actual address. When he confronted Victoria with his suspicions, she became defensive, her usual composure slipping for just a moment, long enough for him to see the desperation beneath. The revelation of Victoria's forgeries was the turning point. Richard hired a private investigator, something he should have done months earlier. What the investigator uncovered was both stunning and heartbreaking. Victoria had been systematically manipulating documents related to Emma's adoption, attempting to erase Sarah's legal rights as biological mother and insert herself as Emma's sole maternal figure. She had intercepted letters and gifts from Margaret, destroyed photographs of Sarah that had been stored in the attic, and created a paper trail designed to eventually exclude Richard from certain parental rights as well. The scope of Victoria's deception was breathtaking. She had been planning for years to have complete control over Emma and the Ashford fortune that would one day be the child's inheritance. The adoption was never about love or family. It was about power and money, about securing her position in a wealthy family by eliminating any connection Emma had to her past. When Richard presented Victoria with the investigator's findings, she did not deny them. Instead, she coldly explained her reasoning. Emma was a reminder of Sarah, a ghost that haunted the mansion and Richard's heart. Victoria had convinced herself that by erasing Sarah's memory and reshaping Emma, she could finally have Richard's full attention and devotion. She spoke without remorse, as if her actions were completely justified by her desire to be first in her husband's life. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. Richard filed for divorce and for a restraining order protecting Emma from any contact with Victoria. The adoption papers were invalidated, the forgeries exposed. Victoria's attempts to paint herself as a victim fell flat when faced with documented evidence of her manipulations and the testimony of Mrs. Wilson and other teachers who had witnessed Emma's decline under her stepmother's care. On the day Victoria moved out of the mansion, Emma watched from her bedroom window. She felt no joy in her stepmother's departure, only a profound exhaustion and a tentative hope that the nightmare might finally be ending. Richard came to sit beside her, placing his arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to lean into her father's embrace without fear that someone would use that moment of vulnerability against her. The road to healing would be long. Richard knew that his own failures had contributed to Emma's suffering, that his absences and his willingness to believe Victoria's lies had cost his daughter years of peace. But he was committed now, truly committed, to making things right. He enrolled Emma in therapy, reached out to Margaret to establish regular visitation, and most importantly, he began the slow process of rebuilding the trust his daughter had lost in him. 6 months after Victoria's departure, the mansion felt different. Light seemed to fill the rooms in a way it had not for years. Emma's laughter, tentative at first but growing stronger with each passing week, could once again be heard echoing through the halls. Richard had transformed his work schedule entirely, turning down international contracts that would take him away from home for extended periods and focusing on business he could manage from Greenwich. Margaret became a regular presence in Emma's life, visiting twice a week and staying for Sunday dinners that Richard insisted on making a tradition. The elderly woman brought with her boxes of photographs, letters, and mementos that Victoria had never managed to destroy, pieces of Sarah's life that Emma had thought were lost forever. Together, grandmother and granddaughter would sit in the garden, looking through pictures and sharing stories, Emma slowly reclaiming the memories that Victoria had tried to steal. The therapy sessions were difficult, but necessary. Emma worked with a child psychologist who specialized in emotional abuse, learning to identify and name the manipulation tactics Victoria had used, understanding that the fear and self-doubt she felt were not her fault, but the result of systematic psychological warfare. Some days were harder than others. There were setbacks and tears, moments when old patterns of anxiety would resurface. But there were also breakthroughs and victories, times when Emma would stand up for herself in small ways that felt monumental. One particularly meaningful moment came during a school presentation. Emma had been assigned to talk about her hero, and she stood before her class, her voice steady despite her nervous hands, and spoke about her mother. She talked about Sarah's kindness, her creativity, the way she had made every ordinary moment feel special. She showed photographs that Margaret had saved, images of a smiling woman with blonde hair and Emma's same blue eyes. When she finished, Emma looked directly at Mrs. Wilson and smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. Richard learned to be present in ways he had never been before. He attended every school event, scheduled weekly one-on-one time with Emma, where she could talk about anything without judgment, and most importantly, he listened. He heard about the fear that still sometimes kept Emma awake at night, the worry that Victoria might somehow return, the complicated feelings of relief mixed with guilt that came from watching her stepmother leave. The legal settlement ensured that Victoria could never contact Emma again. Richard had also established a trust fund in Sarah's name for Emma's future education, a way of honoring the mother whose memory Victoria had tried so hard to erase. Margaret was given legal status as Emma's guardian in the event anything happened to Richard, ensuring that the child would never again be vulnerable to someone who saw her as a means to an end rather than a person worthy of love. As Emma's 10th birthday approached, she asked for something specific. She wanted to plant a garden, a rose garden like the one Sarah had loved, in the spot where she had once spent that terrible night in the storm. Richard agreed immediately, and together with Margaret they spent weeks choosing plants and designing the space. On Emma's birthday, they planted the first rosebush together, a white variety that would bloom every spring, a living memorial to both pain and healing. Standing in that garden, surrounded by the people who truly loved her, Emma felt something she had not felt in years: hope. She understood now that healing was not about forgetting the bad times, but about refusing to let them define her future. Victoria had tried to break her, to mold her into something small and afraid, but Emma was discovering that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. The little girl who had survived that cold November night, who had endured years of psychological manipulation, was growing into someone resilient and brave. The mansion that had once felt like a prison now felt like home again. Emma's artwork brightened the walls, colorful and hopeful, no longer dark and desperate. Her laughter filled the spaces that had been silent for too long. And while she would never forget what she had endured, she was learning that her past did not have to determine her future, that she could carry her mother's memory with pride rather than pain, and that she deserved love, protection, and happiness.